Hello and welcome to the Rubber Duck Dev Show. I'm Chris,
I'm Kristen.
and tonight we're going to talk about strings and symbols and frozen strings and all the strings and things. So, before we do that, we can review. How was your week?
Okay, but I've done less work this week just because it's the beginning of May, which means my kids have all the school year stuff ending and plays and concerts
Yep.
coming out, going all over the place, and rehearsals and testing. And yeah, so
So, Ma and Pa
a
Taxi is
lot
in
of,
full swing.
yeah, a lot of life, a lot of taxiing around. Apart from that, most have been doing database consulting, Postgres consulting this past week. Not so much on the Rails, but that's mostly because I just haven't had time to get into other stuff I needed to do. And making some additional tweaks to my interface or my integration I made with that CRM I was talking about for my application. But other than that, that's pretty much it. What about you?
Well, I just started planning today on a massive refactor of our core engine app because
No risk there.
yeah, not even a little bit. So you can imagine I'm just, free and breezy this week. But yeah, we've got it's been around for a while, and so as a program gets older, especially a big one, you end up with band-aids over the bandages, over the tourniquets, over and that stuff just get all the technical debt going on, and you should kind of take small refactor steps as you're going along, but that didn't happen. So we've got a bit of a situation where um, objects are really kind of tightly coupled and cross-linked, and things are reaching across to other things that they shouldn't be reaching across to, and the object boundaries aren't really being respected. And so we decided that we should just go ahead and take some time and start unspaghettifying that stuff, um, because it's just not in the shape it needs to be. So I'm writing up the plans to move that forward, and it's going to be whew,
Doozy.
it's going to be a mountain climb.
Okay.
I mean, like an Everest style mountain climb. But I kind of enjoy that kind of challenge, taking a mess and
Tests
organizing
will
it.
be your friend.
Oh, but yes. Here is where our large test suite is going to be a happy thing. So we'll see how that goes, but that's probably going to be most of my life for the next, I don't know, 3 or 4 months probably. But we shall see. But I mean, one of the things that we're dealing with in there is speed improvements. Trying to get into speed improvements. So the stuff we're talking about tonight are things that I'm going to try to stay cognizant of as we're doing this refactoring,
Right.
because the things we're talking about tonight have a lot to do with performance. So let's get into that. Strings and symbols and frozen strings. What's that all about? So I think we ought to kind of lay out some definitions, as it were, a bit.
And I think we should also preface this by saying that we're this discussion is predominantly about Ruby,
Yep.
but there's also support for these types of things in other languages, but they may also be called something different.
Right.
So, for example, I use Elixir. They don't have symbols, but they call them atoms, but they're essentially the same thing.
Right.
Also, Python doesn't really have symbols nor atoms, but by default, they in turn string literables. So interning is kind of similar to freezing that we're going to be talking about.
Hmm.
So that's kind of equivalent in Python. And it wasn't until ES6 of JavaScript that they actually have symbols.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know if it's totally the same, but but there are language support for these concepts in other there's support for these concepts in other languages, but mostly tonight we're going to be focusing on Ruby, and we'll kind of mention others
Right.
if we
So
can.
this will be all Ruby terminology, but the concepts should apply to a lot of other
Other
languages.
Right.
Yeah. So, so let's talk about, first of all, we mentioned symbols. What are symbols? So symbols are in Ruby when you have like colon and a name. It's an identifier. You see them a lot in like hashes for as the keys and key value pairs.
Which are like dictionaries or whatever.
Right. Or well, I mean that's kind of the most common place you'll see them in Ruby code. You can use them in other places, but see them a lot there. So what are they? Well, their definition is scalar value objects used as identifiers, mapping immutable strings to fixed internal values, which basically means they're strings that can't be changed. Immutable strings. And if you're not familiar with the term immutable, it just means can't be changed.
Yeah, and when it says two internal values, it does actually map to a particular value. And if you look at the object ID of those symbols, you can create the same symbol more than once, but it's always going to register the same object ID.
Right.
So it's immutable, and it's essentially only one copy of it.
Right. And so that's one of the reasons that symbols came into being, is because as opposed to strings, and this is in Ruby, but most languages kind of follow this convention. If I create a string, it creates a new object in a new memory space. And if I create that exact same string again, it's going to create a different object in a different memory space. So I've just taken up more memory. Whereas a symbol, if I use that symbol over and over, it points to the same object in the same memory space, so it only instantiates once. So that was kind of the purpose for having for symbols existing.
Although it looks like Python, for example, they automatically make their strings immutable for literals.
Right. Yeah, and there are
So
some.
some languages do it a little bit different. So they don't have symbols, but they do that kind of by default instead.
Yeah, like for instance, I think in .NET, when you define a constant, it kind of freezes, it treats it as a frozen string.
Right. Okay.
So, and they, at least when I was working in .NET, they never had the concept of frozen string, but that's how they implemented constants, really. My understanding, anyway. So, most languages have these kind of things going on. Now, so that's the difference between symbols and strings. But now we've got this concept of frozen strings. So what's that all about? And this is something I never really paid a lot of attention to. They were just kind of there, but I was never in a situation where I needed to care about it. So until recently. So what is a frozen string? So essentially what it does is it takes a string object and makes it immutable. So it's basically a symbol from function, but not in form. So in Ruby, what you do is you have some string, your quoted string, dot freeze. That makes it an immutable string. What that means is if I say var equals some string dot freeze, I can't change the content of that variable.
Right. You can't like append more text on the end the way you normally can.
Right. So it essentially becomes, if you're familiar with .NET or other languages that have constants, it becomes a constant essentially. If that's terminology you're familiar with. So,
and my understanding is that it doesn't keep the same. I mean, sorry, it doesn't only point to one memory space because you still have to create the constant. Do you know if I'd have to test it? I can't remember if it creates the same memory space or not.
What, with a frozen string?
Yeah.
Yeah, it puts it in the same memory space. It essentially does almost exactly the same thing that a symbol does. It puts it in the same memory space as the same object. So, one of the articles I was reading is, well, why would I choose symbols versus frozen strings? What's the difference, and why would I want to use them? And fundamentally, I mean, for most applications, there really isn't much of a difference other than readability. What's your perfect personal readability preference between colon name that shows up as blue for in my IDE and string dot freeze? They're mostly functionally equivalent. I mean, there are some minor things that we'll talk about, but so in Ruby 2.2,
So here's an interesting thing,
what's
just
that?
to mention. If you create a string and you freeze it, so you do variable equals double quote string dot freeze, and then you create another one, again, double quotes dot freeze, it gives you the same object ID as long as it's the same string. It'll give you the same object ID, exactly what you're saying.
Right.
But if you create a string, like you say A equals string and then B equals string, and then you say, okay, now freeze it, it's giving me different object IDs, which makes sense.
You mean like you do that and then A dot freeze and then B dot freeze?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because it went ahead and created that string in an unfrozen state. It allocated the memory.
Right.
And then it created a totally separate one, allocated the memory, and then you freeze them separately. Well, they're going to have different,
right.
Even though they're the same string that's frozen, you started it off as independent strings, and therefore they have different object IDs.
Right. And that's kind of where a lot of the confusion lies, is when you say same string, it's the same set of characters, but it's not the same object. So that's, and I think that's where a lot of the confusion comes, because as humans, when we say the string is this, we're meaning what the words say. But that's a computer says, no, it's the object.
Well, it's reference to essentially its memory location of what's
right.
being stored. Yeah.
So, yeah, so there are some tricky gotchas in this stuff that you have to be careful of. Now, Ruby 2.2 started freezing strings as hash keys. When you use a string as a hash key, freezing those by default. In Ruby 2.3, they added this frozen string literal true magic comment, and you'll see that a lot at the top of Ruby files, and it's kind of become just kind of a template for most Ruby developers, is to put that at the top of a lot of their Ruby files. And basically that just, if I make a string, it's frozen by default in that file. So I don't have to do string.freeze. It does that by default. And we'll talk about the pros and cons of that here in a minute.
So an interesting thing to mention about doing that is the symbols by default. I think this is either 2.2 or prior to 2.2. Symbols weren't really garbage collected. So that left a security issue if you accepted this data and you converted it into a converted user input into symbols, and you get random symbols, well, now your Ruby program would grow forever because there's no garbage collection and it would crash.
Right.
So it was like a denial of service issue. So what they actually did, so this is something I found out in doing research, is that there are two different types of symbols. One is called mortal and one is called immortal. So the mortal symbols can be garbage collected. And those are the ones like if you're converting your hash from, as you say, you have string as keys for your hash and you want to do it to sim, like to symbol.
Mm-hmm.
Those are converted because a lot of those are user input. Like if you bring data from the database from a like a JSON B file, it's going to give you string keys for your hashes. It won't do symbols.
Right.
And they do that probably because of these issues prior to Ruby 2.2.
Right.
But now you can convert them to symbols and it'll convert them as mortal, meaning that they can be garbage collected. But there's certain ones that can stay immortal, like when you're defining methods or there's certain things you're using symbols for in those use cases that they stay immortal. So that's just something an interesting add on to kind of what you were mentioning too, I found out.
Yeah. And I saw that too, that they, prior to 2.2, they were having some issues with using symbols used to be a bigger deal because the lack of garbage collection was used as an attack vector. And
yeah, if you're converting them, into symbols, you would blow up your memory.
And doing that is not uncommon. Seeing some string .toSym or some hash toSym.
Or particularly, you take a whole hash you've received, and I can't remember the syntax for Ruby, but you can convert them all to symbol keys as opposed to string keys.
You mean the hash within different access
I think it's called
stuff?
No. If you have a hash that you have that has all string keys, I think it's called symbolize keys is the command.
Right. Yeah.
To convert them all to symbols,
Mm-hmm.
which is great. But imagine before they were mortal, before they were garbage collected, they would be like,
yeah. And if you had a hash with 5 keys, maybe that's a big deal. But if you had a hash with 1,000 keys and you're doing that 1,000 times, you got a problem.
Exactly.
So, yeah. All right. So, symbols versus frozen strings. Then, what's the difference? In terms of performance, all the benchmarks I saw said not much difference.
Yeah.
And
it used to not be the case, but yeah.
Yeah. Currently, I think as of like Ruby 2.5 or 2.6, there really isn't any noticeable difference. Even in hashes with about 1,000 key value pairs that they were doing performance tests on, which is a really big hash, there was negligible difference between frozen string keys and symbol keys.
Symbol keys, yeah.
Well, I just could not get that phrase out. So there's really not a performance difference there. There's certainly a performance difference between frozen and unfrozen keys. When you get to that size, that level of usage, when you're looking at small hashes, it's negligible there too, or small volumes of stuff. The difference between frozen and non-frozen key strings isn't really noticeable. But if you have a large production app or you have very large hashes, that definitely is. So the difference between symbol and frozen strings, as far as I can tell, really has more to do with readability in most cases, especially for like hash keys. What's your readability preference? Than it does with performance. So, I'm a little skeptical about putting that magic freezing the strings comment at the top of every Ruby file by default, because you can break some stuff if you do that without thinking. I mean,
I did find one post. Oh, let me see if I can see what the name was. Give me one sec. Yeah, I don't. It was saying magic comment question mark
yeah,
because he added it to every file in his Ruby project, deployed it, and the performance went.
right. So you have to be a little
He
careful with that.
removed it. He removed it and like deployed another branch, I guess, or prior to that happening, and the performance went back up to normal. So he was like, not so magic.
Yeah, I don't think it's the silver bullet that gets talked about a lot of times. RuboCop has a cop that warns you, hey, you haven't put this here. I'm not entirely
Yeah.
sure that that's a good idea in a lot of cases. Freezing strings is a good idea in a lot of cases, but I think it's better to do that intentionally than put a blanket magic comment there. I just think that magic comment is a little too dangerous.
Well, I mean, I think, yeah, I think that maybe with your own code you're writing, putting in that comment for the files you're writing, it may not be an issue. But if you're adding to files that, like, depending how old the Rails version you're using is, or the Ruby program you're using, or what else are you using that could potentially be impacted by it?
Right. So now let's talk about
But so it's like anything, your mileage may vary, and you gotta test out things and see how it works.
Now there are benefits to frozen strings beyond performance. I mean, performance is one aspect of it, but there are other reasons that you may want to do that. Well, one other reason in particular I can think of, and that is to be able to treat those strings as constants that cannot be changed, so that something in your code doesn't change a string value that you're depending on somewhere else. You want to define it, freeze it, and say this is what it's always going to be.
Yep.
It cannot be changed. So there is an aspect of it being a safety net for some things. This is what constants would do in .NET. If I define something as a constant, it could not be changed anywhere.
And it's kind of odd that constants can be changed in Ruby.
Yeah.
My opinion.
Yeah. That was
it's not a constant.
If it's can be changed, it's a exactly. Dynamic constant. That what? So yeah, that was a little bit
a bit of an oversight.
I ran into that. Yeah. That's not what that word means. So when would I want to use these things? Well, all right, so if I'm doing hashes as strings, I definitely want frozen string keys. If I'm using strings for my hash keys, I want them to be frozen. I don't want to use regular strings. I personally prefer using symbols as hash keys because of readability. They're much easier for me to read.
Less typing too.
Yeah. So that's my preference. From a performance standpoint, there's really no difference there.
The other thing we should mention is that with symbols, at least with Ruby, you can't have spaces in them. So that's a little bit of a issue. And one reason why you have to, I think, or maybe you mentioned this, I'm sorry, I can't remember, but like if you're taking in user input and it's going to be a key of something, well, then you got to, use a string.
Right, because you don't know if they're going to put a space in there, and as soon as there's a space, it can't be a symbol.
Yeah, or convert it beforehand, do something to replace the space with underscore or something.
Yeah.
I don't know.
So either way, you gotta mess with it. So why not just leave it as the string? It's easier to just do dot freeze than dot replace all these with this and camelize and Spacify and all the other things you got to do. Also, there are cases like with certain gyms and stuff and other apps that you may be talking to where they require keys as the as the geez, I'm really having a problem with that. They require strings as the keys. They don't take symbols, so it's not common. But if you're using strings, that's almost universally be accepted, because
Yeah.
even if they're using symbols, they'll usually do a hash with indifferent access, so they don't care.
Yeah.
So
And for those who don't know, hash with indifferent access means you can either you have a hash that's built some way, but you can use either symbols to act as a key for the hash, or you could use a string as the key for the hash.
right. Now you can run into issues with that if for some reason you've got a key name with a space in it, then it can't be a symbol. But if you're putting spaces in your key names, I think we need to have a different conversation with you, because gross. Don't do that. It's just bad. So there's things to think about, but really, frozen keys or my God, I cannot get past frozen strings and symbols don't have a whole lot of difference.
Yeah.
From a performance perspective, they're almost identical. From a readability perspective, they're pretty the same. I mean, everybody has their preference, but they're not that different. And from an accessibility standpoint, as far as accessibility from other apps and stuff, you very rarely run into a situation where it cares which one you're using. So there's not a whole lot of difference there. Now, the difference between strings and frozen strings is a big difference in both performance and the safety net it provides in your coding. So you should use
Well, I don't know a
frozen.
big performance
Well, okay,
that I've seen.
at scale, there
Yeah.
is.
Yeah.
Big
Okay.
enough that if you're trying to do performance improvements, this is a thing that's worth looking at. And it's usually a fairly simple thing to
Sure.
change, so it's
To
big
try.
bang
Yeah.
for the buck.
Yeah.
So if you're going through and doing performance enhancements, or if you know that you're going to have strings at scale, freezing them is a good way to help your performance. It certainly doesn't hurt your performance. But you want to be careful about doing blanket freezes, because you can break stuff very badly. Because there are times when you've got a string variable and you need to be able to change it or append to it or something like that. That happens quite often. So be careful about the blanket magic thing. Don't just always stick that at the top of your file. It's not always a good idea. So, anywho, anything else you could think of on that topic?
Not really. I mean, I think we pretty much beat the horse as it is.
Yeah. It's not.
We talked about other languages and some of their support too. So
Yeah. It's not a complicated topic, but it's confusing because I think a lot of people just don't really dig into it, and I didn't for a very long time, because I didn't really have a need to care. But I think understanding it is important, just understanding the differences, because it's not complex and it can help you in some cases, especially in Ruby, where you don't have any other way to make a constant string.
yep.
A lot of their other types are frozen by default, but strings are not. And so this is the way you can make an actual constant. All right. So I hope you guys enjoyed that. Thanks for joining us tonight. If you did enjoy that, make sure you like, subscribe, follow Twitch, Twitch or
Twitch,
YouTube.
do a Twitch.
I give up. Just mash all the buttons and ding all the bells. Join us every Wednesday night at 8 p.m. Eastern for more Dev Talk. Tell your friends. Next week, we're going to be talking about some new stuff in Ruby 3. It's not, I mean, Ruby 3 isn't new at this point, but it's,
like,
one of the things that was introduced.
We're almost 18 months old.
Right. One of the things that was introduced in Ruby 3, static typing. We're going to be talking about that. Static versus dynamic typing. Who cares? Why should you care?
A lot of people care about dynamic versus static.
Oh, yes. So we're going to have that fun conversation. If you have a topic that you would like to see on the show, and boy, do we need some ideas, please leave it in the comments below. Or you can email it to us at rubberduckdevshow@gmail.com. Or you can reach out to us on Twitter. Or you can, just send us brainwaves. We don't care. We'll take it any way you can give it. Podcasts are available all places that podcasts live. Visit our site, for God's sake, rubberduckdevshow.com. Sign up for our newsletter. See all our stuff. Listen to all our freaking podcasts. Follow us on Twitter at Ducky Dev Show. Till next week, happy programming.